Okay, what we're looking at here is the in position turn c-bet strategy in single raise pots. So this is the first turn node that I'm looking at for single raise pots. If you watched 3-bet pots before this, you might have seen a couple of examples of my format for turn structure here, but I'll just go through quickly what this template is designed to accomplish. So the way that I am approaching turn game planning is to simplify the categories that I created on the flop so that I can look at how turn cards change the texture in a more general way. And mostly it's associated with the bet size that was used on the flop. So you can see that I've marked both flop texture and also flop bet size. And I've separated some of those categories if I thought it was necessary to distinguish the types of turn cards that they're going to be getting. For example, on a paired board, I found it was more important to distinguish between low and high turns than it would have been on like an ace high board or a high low low board. But they both use the same flop bet size. So those were necessary to separate. But I'm now combining something like Jack 10-3, also with Ace 8-4, also with Queen 5-4, right? So high, low, low boards, ace high boards, double Broadway boards where we bet small. The turn textures are going to impact those boards in basically the same way. So by combining them, I'm simplifying the process of figuring out how to size your turn bets and how aggressively to play those turns. Because it's not going to matter, in my experience, whether it's an ace high board or a queen high board, when we're talking about how does a flush card affect our bet sizing? How does a blank affect our checking frequency? So that's the idea with this structure here, is we're just trying to categorize the impact of the turn card on our bet sizing and the impact of that turn card on our checking or betting frequencies. So I've got 5 categories here, and I've marked the most important ones as some of the highest frequency, but also the strategies that I think are a little bit more challenging to play without having studied them. So paired boards are frequently bet on the flop, but they are a less common flop texture in terms of just like how often they're dealt. So this category here, this high, low, low, ace high, 2 Broadway, all combined, all with high frequency bet 25 on the flop. This is going to be probably the most common turn c-bet opportunity that you get. So it's most important that we start here, and that's what I'll do when I go through the analysis a little bit. The mid, low, low, the mid boards and the low, low, low boards that are getting a larger bet size. These I've also marked as high importance because, again, they're dealt frequently. Like these are common textures. But on these textures, the 3/4 pot c-bet is still used a fair bit. It's a pretty common bet size. So we're basically ranking the importance of these turns in your study by how frequent they are and also how impactful having a good strategy in that situation will be. At the bottom here for the database review, I've noted not only the turn c-bet frequency, but also the reaction that you're going to have once you've bet or once you've checked. So the idea here is that at every node, we're looking ahead a little bit to think about how the way we play the turn is impacting the rest of the game tree. So our betting range is going to be impacted by facing turn check raises, and our checking range is going to be impacted by facing river probes. So keeping track of all 3 stats together, I think, is a really powerful way to visualize your whole game plan rather than keying in on just this exact situation that you're playing. So once I fill in the whole sheet, we'll get to how this impacts my game. So I'm going to take a little time in PO Solver now. We'll look at a few examples of turn textures together and find the bet sizes that make sense. So I'm starting here with an ace high board texture. I've put a flush draw on the flop just so that we can see how flush turns affect the situation. And I'm showing the flop strategy quickly just to reinforce the idea that this is a very important node to be studying. We're getting flops like this very frequently. We're betting quarter pot almost full frequency, we're probably just going to simplify this to betting our whole range if we're actually playing the spot. So this turn situation that we get to is going to be quite common. So here is a clean example of a blank turn card where the strategy, without even doing much research into the EVs of removing different bet sizes, we can see pretty clearly that overbet is a very useful bet size. And anyone who's watched my content, or I'm sure a lot of other players' content in recent years, knows that these blank turn cards are very commonly overbet as the second barrel. Now, if we go to the hotness chart, we could just see the turn strategy for all possible turn cards, and we can see how different properties might affect the way that we play. So there's a cluster of turns here where I'm seeing the overbet strategy that is similar to what we're looking at right now, being very clearly replicated. And I can just click through them here. That's going to be the jack, the queen, the king, and also the deuce to some extent. The deuce seems to act pretty similarly. So what we're basically looking at is turn cards that miss the draws on the flop. We're looking at turn cards that are, 10 through king and also deuce. Those are cards that don't interact with the straights. And we're also looking at, non-flushes. When the flush comes in, no matter what the turn card is, we're only seeing 75% getting used. When the straight comes in, we're also seeing 75% getting used. And when the board pairs, we're seeing something between 75 and 25% getting used. So those are categories of turns that I'm recognizing just by looking at the hotness chart. This is made possible by having turns pre-saved in your PioSolver sim. So if you have small saves, this is very easy to load. If you have micro saves, you won't be able to load this so quickly because it'll have to run all the turns each time you open it. So let's look at a couple different variations on this texture. So I was suggesting that a queen high board of similar ranks would have the same type of turn strategies. We can see if that holds true, generally speaking, by looking here. So here I've got a queen high board with a low straight draw possible on the flop. Can see that the deuce and the 3 are getting that kind of overbet or overbet heavy strategy, similar to what we just looked at on the ace high board. You can also see that the 9 is close, although that does complete one straight. But the 10, the jack, the king, the ace, we're seeing on these cards predominantly overbet strategies. So that's the 150% pot, by the way. And I didn't have a flush draw on this flop that I just selected, so there's no difference in the suits that I can see. Although the straight completers are acting very similarly to what we saw on the ace high board. The straight completers are getting a smaller bet size. Board pairs are also getting a smaller bet size. And similar to the ace high board, we're considering something even smaller than 75% pot. So that pattern seems to be holding true so far. We can look at one more example, perhaps. I think I mentioned Broadway flops as well. We can see how a Broadway flop gets played if we are to bet quarter pot on the flop. Remember, this whole category that we're looking at right now is just for quarter pot flop bets. That's important. So on this Jack 10 X board, ignoring the 3, which pairs the board, it looks like all the low cards that miss the straight and miss the flush are getting overbet or check, polarized strategies. All of the spades are getting 75%. The board pairs are going even smaller, although the 3 here, the 3 seems to be not a super impactful board pair, which could make sense just because of preflop ranges. And then on straight completers, we're seeing those overbets start to go away. So on the 8, on the 9, on the queen, we're seeing those overbets go away. The king and the ace are a little bit special here. It is a straight completer, but it's Broadway straight. So that's going to favor the in-position player and not reduce the equity of our range as much. So this is where the categories that we write in the sheet need a little bit of human flexibility to interpret on the fly, like, okay, yeah, this is a straight completer turn. Normally I reduce my sizing on straight completer turns, but big blind never has king queen pre-flop because they didn't 3-bet me. So even though it's a straight completer, it's not a very relevant straight completer. Similar to why, the king, or I think even on the other board, we were seeing like certain straights not impact the strategy as much as other straights. On the king, ace queen is not possible. Queen nine suited, I think, is also three betting. So we're only looking at some queen nine offsuits. There's different levels of how impactful a straight completer or a flush completer could be. So that's where a little bit of intuition comes in to recognize how big of an impact this particular turn card that you're playing is going to have on the bet sizing. So I think the pattern here is pretty clear. We can go back to the sheet and look at a few things that I've filled in. So here I've filled in just the very basic details of what it is that I want to do on these turn cards. And I'm trying to summarize a strategy that I think is, both appropriately simple, but also appropriately close to the theoretical strategy that we found in the solutions. So I've got blank turn cards, flush or straight completer, and board pairs. And these are categories of turns that I've created not in advance of looking at those sims, but as a result of looking at those sims before I started recording. So it became clear to me that blanks are getting overbet as their main bet size. And I noted high checking frequency, which tells me this is a polarized strategy with a tight value range. On flush and straight completers, we were seeing mostly 75% pot as the bet size. And this brings the checking frequency back in line a little bit with the average. What I'm calling mid checking frequency is just going to be like roughly the GTO turn C bet frequency, right? So if we're betting about 45% of the time, then the imposition check frequency is average or mid. And on paired turn cards, I was seeing a lot of this smaller bet. Now, the actual strategy that's getting played here is a little more complicated, but for the sake of a simple structure that helps guide, the way that I want to approach the spot in reality, this is sufficient in telling me like, hey, this spot gets played differently. You want to think about really small bet sizes, and that opens the door for some opportunities, maybe to find good exploits, or to just build a strategy that makes sense to me without having such a high checking frequency. I think this is the type of turn card that will lead a lot of people to just play too passive. So this is a reminder to me of the way that we can avoid being too passive on this type of turn texture is by finding small bet sizes. So let's go through that same process again. We'll look at the follow through on B75 for some of these mid and low boards, and we'll see how that changes things. So I'm going to start us off on actually the same sim that I had open for 2 Broadway on quarter pot bet sizing, just to show you the impact of changing the flop bet size to the turn strategy in general. It appears to me that what happens when we increase our flop bet size, and this isn't a huge effect, so it might seem like I'm just looking at pretty much the same chart that we were looking at before. But I think what's happening is we're playing a little bit more conservatively on those connected turn cards, which makes sense to me because increasing the flop bet size is going to reduce the number of speculative flop calls that we get from our opponent. And it's going to be a more equity-driven range that reaches the turn. So when, the 8 comes, when the spade comes, even when the high spade comes or the high straight completer comes, we're seeing, I think, a bit more checking, a bit more conservative bet sizing, so less consideration of overbets. And that's the way that I would generally think about adjusting bet sizes for turn play, is the more money that went in on the flop, the tighter the ranges have become, and usually they're restricted towards equity-driven hands. So those equity changing turn cards are going to have a bigger impact if the flop bet size was bigger. So let's look at a few closer textures to what this category is actually meant to be. We can look at a low, low, low board where this bet size is used more frequently. And I just want to make sure, we are getting it used a fair bit on this texture. So here we've got a turn strategy starting from the low, low, low flop and 3/4 pot flop c-bet. The spades, again, now having a bigger impact. The previous textures were showing a lot of bet 75. Here we're seeing bet 75 on the good spades, like the low spades that don't change anything else. But we're seeing a reduction to bet 25% on higher spades, or also the four straight cards. Well, the four straight cards just in general, we're seeing a reduction to 25%. Other than that, what I'm noticing is that overbetting is just less common in general. It's still a fine play on, the 10, the jack, the queen, the king, but we're seeing 75% take over as kind of the predominant bet sizing. And I suspect the reason for this is that the top card is changing. And because the top card is changing, we're seeing a lot of former top pairs, which are now second pairs, or former over pairs, which are now under pairs to the top card, trying to continue to value bet. So just using this turn card as an example, it's a clean blank, it's a disconnected card, but it devalues tens, jacks, queens. It devalues ace nine, king nine, or not king nine, ace nine, queen nine, jack nine, 9-8 suited, 9-7 suited. So a lot of these hands on the deuce or the three would be viable overbets. You can see like tens, jacks, queens, kings debating between overbet and 75%. But because more money went in on the flop, because there's a tighter range that we're up against here, the equity of these hands is not as high as it would be on a different texture. Now, this is a pretty coordinated low, low, low board. Let's contrast this with our typical very blank low, low, low board. And by looking at this one, I think we should see the other extreme. Just wanted to make sure that overbet wasn't getting used on the flop. It's not significant. So here, well, let's just look at all turn cards, but you can see clean overbet strategy on this 10. And just a lot more overbetting in general on this texture. So there's no flush completers possible, so the suits are not making a big difference. But the non-straight completers, so 7, 9, 10, jack, queen, all of them predominantly overbet. The king also predominantly overbet. The ace starting to look, a little more conservative on the ace. We definitely need to tighten up our value range and respect the number of aces in our opponent's range after they call a low, low, low board. They're going to have a lot of ace highs. The straight completers, again, being played conservatively, so that pattern holds true. The board pairs are getting like 75% pot on this texture. The board pairs not having quite as big of an impact. It seems like even when the 8 pairs, for example, we can still keep betting a lot of our over pairs. And we certainly have a lot of 8s ourselves. We're also seeing a lot of betting from 6s, 5s, 4s. That's noteworthy. I am curious just to look back at the more coordinated texture, because I did not notice how board pairs were getting played. Looks like also 75%, at least on this one. Yeah. So 75% on the board pairs. Even when it completes the flush, it doesn't seem to be such a problem for in position. So it's noteworthy that on these low boards, the blanks are not as blank as they used to be when there's equity to be worried about, when there's, I think, especially a flop flush draw, which is going to allow for like turned top pair plus flush draw to be in our opponent's range, or the gut shots on the flop, so turn top pair plus gut shot on the flop. Whereas on that other board, the 8-3 deuce, hitting that overcard was so unlikely for our opponent. So it was not a concern for our bet sizing. So it's pointing to the distinction between, blank and not blank. It isn't always just about whether a flush comes in or whether a straight comes in. There's a little bit, again, of human interpretation that's necessary when you're playing these spots that I can't so easily summarize in a spreadsheet that says, like, these are your blank turn cards and these are your not blank turn cards. On different low, low, low boards, some overcards are blank, some overcards are not blank. So that's something that you're going to have to intuit when you're playing these situations. So I've gone back here and I've input the quick summary of how I would like to approach these situations. Again, I've stayed with the blank versus flush straight nomenclature for how to separate these turn textures. But as I pointed out just now, not every overcard is going to be a true blank, there is some reason to be conservative. If, for example, an overcard comes, that's also possible for our opponent to have. But still, the 150% sizing is accurate for true blanks. So I do still want to approach blanks in this way. And I've written mid checking frequency. I don't know if you noticed as I was going through the sim, but just the overall betting frequency is higher in these situations because of the wider value range that we have on these low textures. There's more hands that can bet big sizes for value. It's still a polarized range, but that range has a higher betting frequency than we would on these types of textures. Same for the paired board. We noticed that the pairs were not impacting the strategy as much as they were on these other textures. So here we're sticking with B75, but we are, playing a more conservative value range on these textures. It was a lot of trips and some overpairs, but not quite as wide as we get to go on these other situations. So more checking happening on the paired boards. So I'm not going to go through filling in every single sizing and check frequency here. I am just going to skip at this point to the completed version of the sheet and talk a little bit about what I noticed in my own turn c-betting game. So here I've got the final version of the turn c-bet sheet, where I filled in all the bet sizes that I thought were useful based on this set of sims for the different categories of flops. Now, there's a couple situations that I didn't get to in the detailed analysis where more than one bet sizing was being used in a way that I thought was noteworthy. There were some cases, for example, when we looked at paired boards on high, low, low texture, bet 25 was not the only bet size being used, but I thought that it was useful to think about bet 25 as my main bet size, and also thinking about overbluffing that as a note that I made to myself for a possible exploit. But on paired boards, I was finding it hard to just stick to one of these two bet sizes because I was seeing distinct parts of the range using each bet size in a way that wasn't, totally pointless. So I would consider using an in-between bet size as a way to, I wrote this as an exploit, it's really more of a simplification. I would consider this as a simplification, and this is something I would want to run separately, maybe put together a few paired boards and run a script where 50% is the only turn bet size. But for the time being, I just left it as is here, making note to myself that both bet sizes are viable on that paired flop texture. Because of course, if we go bet 25 on the flop and then only bet 25 on the turn, we're not putting very much money into the pot with the better parts of our range. So it is worth considering having larger sizes, I think. Same came up on the monotone flop 4 flush turn. Now, this is just a very rare spot, so I'm not going to worry too much about getting across what's happening here. But I did think it was interesting. If you're curious to look at some monotone single raise pots, I did think there was an interesting opportunity there to lean towards the small bet with bluffs and to lean towards the overbet with value. I think you'll be surprised by what these strategies look like if you're interested to run some of those sims yourself. So I filled in all of the possibilities here. I kept the bet sizings pretty trimmed down, and I feel good that this is a set of bet sizes that I can remember in game. There's a lot of patterns that develop when you go through this process. You'll see, flush straight B75, flush straight B75, flush straight B75. If we ignore paired boards, I've basically found the bet size that I want to use for all flush straight turns on all textures. Great. Blank B150, blank B150, blank B150, the only exception being monotone boards. Great. Now I know that on blank turns, I'm always overbetting, and the only exception I need to think of is monotone boards don't get that overbet unless we're playing a 4 flush turn. So by writing all of this out, I can consolidate a lot of information. You can see that turn textures, after going through a bit of work, are really not that complicated, but it does require the willingness, I suppose, to simplify away a lot of the noise that we see in the original sims. So that's why I go through this process with you. I went through a whole bunch of sims, tried to weed out as much noise as possible, tried to maintain as much EV as possible, but put together a bet sizing scheme that I think is really reasonable. So what did I notice about my own game? I filled in my database stats here. My turn c-bet in the Legend Showdown was 41%. Not particularly low compared to GTO, although if I remember right, my flop c-bet was also low. So in combination, I'm getting concerned that this is not an aggressive enough strategy. The next thing I noticed, which I've marked here in red, which should actually be marked. Oh yeah, red is correct because I'm underfolding. What I've marked here is a low fold to turn check raise. This is a big indicator that I like to use with my students, especially with samples that are larger than this. I would recommend, not looking at fold to turn check raise over 3K hands, but I do know about myself that this was a real problem. What low fold to turn check raise means is not that not necessarily that I'm playing poorly versus turn check raise. What it means is that the bluff portion of my turn betting range is not wide enough. I don't have enough true bluffs in this range. So once I face the check raise, I don't have enough easy folds. I don't have enough hands that are just obviously supposed to fold to the turn check raise. What hand classes might be causing this? I'm not sure. What board textures am I not betting enough? Again, I'm not sure. If I was a hand to note user, I know that they have some pretty powerful charts within the HUD that can show the distribution of hands that's betting the turn. And you could even look at your specific hand replays for the types of categories of hands that you are betting on the turn. So that would be a good way to review this. I don't use hand to note. So the way that I would like to address this is through training. And by training the situation, I can get feedback every time that I miss a turn bet that I'm supposed to be making. And as I start to get that feedback more and more, I can start to categorize what types of situations it is that I'm missing in this turn barrel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this video here. I'm going to load a couple of drills that I can use for this situation. And I'm going to show you my training process for facing, for playing the turn c-bet opportunity.